I want to turn and talk to you now. We have a guest joining us online. We have Chuck DeVore, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about him. He's been on the show before. Chuck DeVore is he's with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is an extraordinary state-based think tank here in Texas. It is a leader among state-based think tanks in inspiring legislatures and individual citizens to embrace and support conservative solutions to the problems that we face as states and countries. He is their vice president of national initiatives. He works on criminal justice reform and frequently writes about the economy and how energy, tax, and regulatory policies influence general prosperity. As a background, he was a Reagan White House appointee in the Pentagon from 1986 to 1988. He served as on the staff of a U.S. congressman. He was a city commissioner. He's just held all sorts of positions. He's been I don't even see it in the little bio here, but I believe he was a state legislator in California. But the reason I wanted to have him come on is this. He's a great guy, first of all, just a fount of knowledge. But he's been doing a lot of writing about contrasting the outcome, the impact of economic policies, comparing Texas, where we strive to support free markets, limited government, limited regulation, and the impact on the economy and jobs and on people in Texas, contrasting Texas with California, which has beautiful beaches and lovely weather, but an enormous big government mentality pervades California. And so Chuck's been writing about this in various places, and I want all of us to be talking about the idea that the policies our lawmakers embrace, whether it's Texas and conservatism or California, practically socialism, what that means for the average Joe, the average person, what the impact is on those policies that the legislature embraces. So without further ado, and I hope we have him online. Hi, Chuck.
Hello, how are you, Debbie?
I'm very well. It's nice to see you.
Great to be back.
So I'm going to plant one seed and then get into these articles you've written recently. You're getting people's feathers ruffled. You're kind of pointing out some of the weaknesses in California's policies. But I want to start with the idea and just kind of go back to it periodically. A lot of people vote for big government programs, big government policies, because they think they think they're kinder, that they're better, that somehow the way to make life better for people is to make government bigger. And this is what allures people a lot to voting for people who stand up for big government, who fight for big government policies. So, and frankly, especially women seem to suffer from this, that, I can't solve everything, but I can vote for big government, and government will solve everything. So I want to talk about what's really happening on the ground in California. First of all, just to start with, you wrote a piece, this was in Forbes last month, workers moving from San Francisco to Austin would get an immediate 46% raise due to less regulation. Okay, how can that be? Tell us about that.
Well, this is about the cost of living in major metropolitan areas. And what you find all over the country is that while there is some of the cost of living differential due to location, in the case of San Francisco, it is in California, it's in the Bay Area. However, anyone who's been to San Francisco knows, as Mark Twain once said, the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. So it's not exactly known for its good weather like Southern California, where I was from. But the fact is that because of burdensome zoning regulations, environmental regulations, high taxes, the inability to build new projects in San Francisco and the surrounding communities, what you find is that rent is 2, 3, 4 times higher. And so if you're someone working in the high-tech industry and you move from the burgeoning, from the established high-tech industry in Silicon Valley to the burgeoning industry in the Austin area, you could have the same paycheck, the exact same pay level, and your effective standard of living will be almost 50% higher.
That is truly astonishing, and I do know that about California. I know that in everything costs more in San Francisco to start with, and then on top of that, the restrictions on building I was particularly aware of. So you just drive up the cost of everything that involves you're living your life, renting your place, finding a place to live. It's all driven up by, and that's such an interesting parallel. So I'd love to have you just share more about this idea why it costs so much more to live in San Francisco than in the great state of Texas. Are there other examples?
Well, if you look all across California, it's not just San Francisco. It's Los Angeles, it's San Diego, and even some of the smaller, more rural communities. All of them suffer from to one degree or another, overregulation, restrictive zoning, environmental laws, greenhouse gas restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. Higher labor costs due to California's pro-labor union rules. And all of this conspires to make it very, very difficult to build new single-family homes, new apartments, new retail establishments, new office complexes, new manufacturing. And as a result now, you're seeing California consistently being shown by the U.S. Census Bureau to have the nation's highest supplemental poverty rate. A lot of your listeners probably don't know that the official poverty rate that's been around for 55 years uses the same poverty threshold for 48 states, for the contiguous 48 states. They have special thresholds for Alaska and for Hawaii. But what census does is they say, well, the poverty measure, the level over which you are earning money that brings you out of poverty, is the same in Manhattan as it is in Lubbock, Texas. Right now, that's patently ridiculous, right? And
Yeah.
so that official measure had been criticized for many, many years by people in Congress and by advocates for the poor. And so it took 20 years, but the U.S. Census Bureau, in concert with other federal agencies and academics, worked for 20 years to create the supplemental poverty measure, which was rolled out in 2009. And ever since that measure was rolled out and published 10 years ago, California has had the nation's highest supplemental poverty measure. And the most recent 2 or 3 year average period, I think they like to average 3-year periods. So the most recent period for which data is available, it was released last September, shows that California's poverty measure is once again the highest in the country, and proportionately, as I recall, is 29% higher than is Texas. Texas's poverty measure is within the margin of error of the survey. So that to me is a very basic measure of how is a state doing, how is the state's policies performing for the most vulnerable residents of the state. And here you have California prides itself for its left of center policies, I'd argue progressive policies. They have the highest individual income tax rate in the country, marginal top tax bracket of 13.3%. They bring in a lot of money. Their government spends about 50% more than does Texas. So it's a big government state with a lot of regulations. And yet, in spite of all of that, they have the highest poverty rate in the country.
I'm going to ask you, just mentioned a moment ago that California spends about 50% more than Texas. What is the relative, you're talking about absolute dollars?
That's a great question. As I recall, we're looking at per capita. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm sure I should know, but which state has a bigger population, California or Texas?
California is about 60% larger than is Texas. The two states together, 1 in 5 Americans call home.
Wow.
And one very interesting thing, Debbie, is that there are only 4 minority-majority states in the country. These are states that look like demographers tell us America will look like in the future. And the 2 states that look most like America's future are Texas and California. The other 2 states that are majority-minority are Hawaii and New Mexico.
Wow. Okay. I want to go back to this idea because in California, I have to tell you that I think that people are drawn to the idea that California is at least trying to help the poor. They're trying to do things, so they have all sorts of government programs in place, and they're trying to protect the environment, but they are spending a fortune. They're spending 50% more than Texas per capita, so it's a fair comparison, even though California is bigger. So they're spending more per capita, and at the end of the day, they still have the highest poverty rate in the country. That is just, right. Can you put those 2 facts together, explain how that could be?
Well, I think it comes down to the greatest determiner of poverty in America is whether or not you have a job. And in the jobs front, Texas has just been crushing California for quite a long time. It's true that after the Great Recession, which California suffered disproportionately more than the rest of the country, Texas, by comparison, had a very shallow recession compared to California and the rest of the country. And so when the recovery finally began to get traction, California did recover more rapidly and was producing more jobs for a while than was Texas. But that is now calmed down. And what you see is that Texas, as a percentage of private sector jobs, continues to grow much more strongly than does California. And because the cost of living is so much lower here, when you do get a job, you're more able to support your family in Texas than in California. And so even the working poor are much more likely to be poor in California than they are in Texas. Now, one last thing about this supplemental measure that some of your listeners may not appreciate is that not only does it take into account the cost of living, at least insofar as housing costs, it also takes into account non-cash benefits that are not counted under the old official poverty measure. So, for example, your Section 8 housing vouchers, the value of those housing vouchers aren't counted toward the poverty limit under the official poverty measure, but they are counted under the supplemental. The same with food stamps, now known as SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Out-of-pocket medical expenses, job-related childcare, transportation expenses. All of these things are accounted for in the supplemental measure. So it's a far more comprehensive and accurate measure of poverty that we're talking about here. And again, California's poverty measure, and remember, this is with a state that from a demographical standpoint, is very much like Texas. Both states have about the same percentage of Hispanics. Texas has much closer to the national average of African Americans. Texas is about 12.5% African American versus roughly 13.5% nationally. California is about 6.5%. Asians, California is about 14.5%. Texas is about 4.5%. So when you look at all the data, you see that these two states are very diverse, and yet Texas's supplemental poverty measure is within the margin of error of the national average.
I am so grateful for people like you that will actually dive into data, process it, be able to make actual relevant comparisons, and be able to describe them in a way that you can follow. I really, really appreciate that skill and talent and your willingness to work so hard on it, because I think as Americans look at moving forward in this country and how we're going to, we have a huge argument. I know that TPPF is a nonpartisan group. We're not talking politics, but we have a big election coming up next year where a lot of the argument is that there is a huge problem with poverty in America. On the left, there's an argument there's a poverty problem, and the way to solve it is, of course, to have bigger government. That is usually the answer of the more left-wing mindset, the big government mindset. And I'm grateful that you're pointing out essentially exactly the opposite is true. At least if you compare California versus Texas. I want to shift now to this, the next thing about the tax rates in these states. You wrote a piece also. Low tax states are adding jobs at double the pace of high tax states since the Trump tax cut. So you're talking about very recent, since the Trump tax cut went into place. Low tax states are adding jobs at double the pace of high tax states. Would you explain why that would be, what the thinking is behind all that?
Yeah, this is a fascinating case. It's almost like an economic experiment unfolding before our eyes. When I was in the legislature, I was the vice chairman of the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the state assembly, and as a result, all of the tax bills came through the committee, and of course, I voted no a lot on that committee, usually to no avail. And so one of the things that was very fascinating to me was that one of the more controversial aspects of the big Trump tax cut and reform signed into law by the president in December of 2017 was this limitation of the state and local tax deduction to $10,000 per filing household. Now, the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, known by the acronym SALT, the SALT deduction was essentially a subsidy for high tax states and localities. Because what happened was, if you are one of the Americans who itemized their individual income tax return, and roughly 30 to 40% of Americans do, depending on which state you're from. So if you're one of those 30 or 40% that itemizes, what would happen is you got to deduct the full amount of your state and local taxes off of your taxable income. And so whatever tax bracket you were in, essentially, roughly speaking, about a third of the state and local taxes that you were paying were then picked up by the federal government, by taxpayers in other states. So if you were in high tax New York or high tax New Jersey or high tax California, and you paid $20,000 in state and local taxes, basically roughly $6,500, $7,000, depending on your tax bracket, you got back, right? You paid that much less in federal taxes. And so now we're limiting that to $10,000 per filer. And so that has the effect, Debbie, of changing the tax code in all 50 states simultaneously. That has the same practical economic effect of doing that. And so I hypothesized when this came out, I thought, I'm going to start looking at the state level numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and look at state level private sector job growth and see whether or not there starts to be a divergence between the growth rate in the states that have low taxes below that $10,000 threshold and states that have high taxes above the $10,000 threshold. And sure enough, you started to see a divergence very quickly. The data started to show up within 3 months of the change in the tax code. And what that tells me is people with money, small business people, investors, people who are making decisions whether to expand their family-owned factory in California or expand it in Illinois or expand it in Texas, they're making decisions that say, hey, I can't deduct as much on my taxes for this wholly owned enterprise that we own in our family. I can't deduct it now in California. It's going to cost me more money. So let's go to Texas. And so what we're seeing now is the rate of job growth in the 29 states that are low tax is double that of the job growth in the 21 high tax states since the change in the tax code in December of 2017.
That's a great summary. And the basic point is tax policy does actually impact the decisions employers make of where to open businesses. You do actually drive business away with a high tax state and you invite business with a low tax state, which then in turn gives jobs to people who need them, especially people who are looking around for a job. They're gonna want to be in the states where the job creators are comfortable coming because their taxes aren't so high. It is so interesting, the idea that it shouldn't be such a revelation, but high taxes, people actually strive to avoid high taxes. They do. They don't want to pay more taxes than they have to. They will make adjustments in their businesses and their personal lives to avoid taxes. It's just I guess that's about as surprising as it's hot in Texas in the summer or something. You actually had another piece I wanted to mention briefly, that you made a comparison of, you had a piece called 75,000 jobs added in May since January 2017. Manufacturing jobs are up 3.9%. 4 times the government rate. So essentially, you're talking about, and this was a piece just from, I don't have the date right here, but anyway, I guess it was from, I don't know when it was written, but in any case, very recent piece you wrote, arguing basically about the idea that manufacturing jobs are up 4 times the government rate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I was very interested in comparing was like periods of time under the last administration versus the current administration. And the reason why it's important to compare like periods is that the latter part of the Obama administration was during what many economists would call it the mature phase of a business cycle, right? All of the early rebound from the Great Recession was over with. The economy was basically growing at a relatively steady rate. And so comparing, for example, the same 24-month period, basically the last 24 months under Obama with the first 24 months under President Trump, and so on. Because if you go back to the early days of the recovery, obviously there were huge gains in employment recovering from the Great Recession, albeit it was one of the most anemic recoveries ever in modern U.S. economic history. But that said, it was still a recovery. And so one of the things I found fascinating was looking at the number of manufacturing jobs added versus the number of government jobs added. And government jobs being defined as both federal, state, and local government jobs. And what you saw under the last couple of years under President Obama was government jobs. And there's roughly, as I recall, about twice as many people working in government as working in manufacturing these days. So just looking at the raw number of jobs added, government jobs already kind of have an advantage because there's so many more of them, but roughly 2 to 1. And what you saw is under the Obama administration, we were adding a lot more government jobs than we were adding manufacturing jobs. And I was looking at this
Wow.
thinking, this is not good. I mean, how do we pay the taxes to pay for those government employees? And as soon as the president was elected, even before he was sworn in, as soon as he was elected, you see the rebound in manufacturing jobs start immediately because people making hiring and investment decisions within manufacturing were anticipating that this president would reduce regulations and eventually reduce taxes. And they were right. So they made certain investment decisions based on the expectation that this president would not what he said about red tape. And sure enough, you see manufacturing jobs take off. And at the same time, government job growth starts to slow down. And so now you're seeing more manufacturing jobs being added nationwide than government jobs. And I think that that's healthy. I think that's sustainable.
Oh, I love the idea because every government job is obviously directly paid by the taxpayer. Every employee is directly paid by the taxpayer. It's not a private business adding a good or service, some benefit to society, and then getting income for it, and then using that to compensate their employees. It's just government, it's just taxpayers writing their checks to the government that's turning around and paying those salaries. So I love that. Chuck DeVore, I just find what you do fascinating and just honestly so beneficial to America to really get below the surface of all the kind of happy sounding political promises. We can make things free, we can provide things, everything will be fine, our economy will be booming, and to really dig into the numbers is it's just so helpful. I appreciate your work. Also, I want to mention the website where your work it can be found and much, much more, just wonderful work by the Texas Public Policy Foundation is texaspolicy.com. Actually, let me make sure of that, Chuck, texaspolicy.com, right?
There you go.
Okay. And I just appreciate your work so much. And you're making the logical laying out of data that help people see that what Texas, it's not just because Texas is the greatest state in the country, but it's also because the policies we embrace really do end up helping the little guy, helping the people who've got to find a job, keeping the cost of living down because of dropping or not having so much regulation, keeping taxes low. It is just a whole picture that is a picture of it's just opportunity and a picture of being able to create a good life under the kind of policies Texas has. So, Chuck DeVore, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Great to talk with you. Thanks so much. That, my friends, Chuck DeVore, Texas Public Policy Foundation. Great organization.